You're listening to Curated Consciously, your all-in-one platform for navigating and nurturing your conscious living journey. Why? Because diving into environmental justice comes with heartache and a lot of damn work. We gotta do it, but as a community, we can make the load a little lighter. Every week, we're bringing you stories, insight, and wisdom from a diverse community of leaders, activists, and influencers, helping you live a more holistic lifestyle that connects your health, wellness, and love for Mama Earth. This podcast is sponsored by Cause Artists, the world's #1 platform for social impact and innovation stories around the world. If you're looking to get inspired, hit us up at causeartist.com. And of course, I'm your host, Jasmine Rain, Curator-in-Chief at Curated Consciously and social entrepreneur. You can connect with me and our community on Instagram at Curated Consciously. Now, roll your shoulders back, get comfy, put the coffee on. It is time to deep dive into some thought-evoking conversation, Curated Consciously. Anjana, what does it mean to be a climate researcher?
What I would like to start off with is I want to make a distinction between climate research when it comes to industry versus climate research when it comes to academia. And I think this holds true for all research fields. So when you work for a corporate environment, you have a different set of objectives, right? You're working for client-oriented goals. Whereas in academia, you're kind of working for to expand the existing breadth of knowledge in the world. So right now I'm working for a wind energy consultancy. It's a corporate environment. My day-to-day work is basically consulting clients on, our clients are mostly investors and developers who run wind farms or want to set up wind farms. So I study the climatic phenomena that will affect the wind energy outputs for them. What are the natural hazard risks associated with their wind farms? What are the effects of, let's say, cyclones or typhoons on their wind farms? Is it risky for the turbines? So that's my day to day. And most of that deals with large scale atmospheric circulation. Whereas when I was working for research institutions previously, we used to work on climate models. And that's mostly what climate scientists do. When you hear the term climate scientist, like when they're working for, research institutions like the Potsdam Institute, they'll be working on climate models that deal with all kinds of circulations. It's not just atmospheric. There's oceanic circulations, there's sea ice dynamics. There's a lot more things that you have to keep up with in order to do research in academia. And I still try to keep up with that side of research as well. But yeah, this is my day to day.
Yeah, no big deal. A huge day-to-day process. That's beautiful. I'm curious, as someone who, did you enter this field because you were, I guess what brought you into kind of becoming a climate researcher? Like, where did that passion come from? Why did you choose this field?
Okay, this is kind of an interesting story. So my dad was the one who introduced me, I think, to the whole, climate change um, discourse, and he showed me An Inconvenient Truth by Al Gore when I was in high school, and that was concerning for me. But I still didn't think that it was something I could build a career in, because especially when you grow up in India, I spent high school here, so there was no option of like doing something like this for a future career. Um, and I was just like, okay, it exists, but like I'll figure that out along the way. So I took physics. So my background is actually a master's in physics, and I took that because it allows you to kind of branch out into any career path, which is one of the cool things about like pure sciences. So in my second year of my degree, I think I was like, okay, I want to know how I can get into the climate space with my physics background. And so I began to look for institutes in India that do research and that accept, people with my kind of a background. And then I found the Institute of Oceanography. I got a scholarship to work there. So that's really the place that opened up my eyes to all the career options that were available to me. I didn't even know that, like I had never considered academia as an option either, because in my mind it was always like, oh, if you do research, that means you're working for R&D departments in companies, or
Right.
you're like a professor at a university, and that was boring for me in my mind. Yeah.
Yeah, so it does. So what I'm hearing is it does stem from the sense of understanding kind of what was happening in terms of climate change from a young age,
Yeah.
and being passionate about science and being a master of physics. That's amazing. A master's in physics. I literally, there's nothing more badass than a female like scientist, is what I've always thought. Like, it's just way too cool. So I'm curious then. So after this journey and working in industry, do you find that your role makes you more optimistic or maybe a little bit more pessimistic about the future of our climate and how communities and corporations impact our environment?
Yeah, if I had to plot that in a graph, I would say it would start from the top at like naive optimism before I stepped into the field. So before I started, really researching and understanding the scale of the problem, I was quite optimistic about it. I was like, oh yeah, someone will find a solution. I mean, come on, everyone's talking about it. And then when I
Wink.
when I began to research, and along with the science part of it, I in my free time I was really interested in social and economic aspects of what's driving all of this. And when I began to get really deep into that, it just plummeted into this like extreme pessimism, where I was like, oh my gosh, we are so screwed. There is no way out of this. We're in too deep. And then I think over the last two, and that got me into this feeling of like latent anxiety, like it was just hanging over me all the time. I couldn't enjoy myself, like I couldn't go to a party or go to malls with my friends. Whenever like your friends ask you to do social things, I'm just like, oh my gosh, are you guys not worried about the planet burning? Like in my head it was always like, how do you enjoy yourself when everything's going to hell? And then
Totally resonate with that.
yeah, and then I realized that for my own mental health, I had to, come out of that. And so, and that only happened like towards the end of university after a couple of my internships, and then I was just like, okay, I need to calm down and just, understand that it's not my burden to carry. So now I'm at this like stage of just realism where I'm like, I'm not pessimistic about this. I have hope, but hope is not optimism. Like I don't expect things to work out, but I just hope that they will.
Yeah, I really resonate with that. And I feel like, for individuals who are working in, like, whether it's in social impact, whether you're working as a climate researcher, like I just can't even imagine the, like, already as someone who has worked in the social impact space for quite some time and has worked in nonprofit and sustainable development. I feel like as I've aged and as I've absorbed more and learned more and worked in more communities, and that hope starts to kind of just slowly disappear and dwindle into the distance.
Mm.
And yeah, and I think it's really important what you said is that, is when you're in it every day and you're seeing firsthand just how big the problem is, that sometimes you do have to put yourself first. Like, your mental health
Yeah.
is a priority in order for you to do the work that you need to do to help solve the problem. Um, so I really resonate with that. And I'm curious, as I guess, as someone, because you're also this cool young human, and I'm curious, I'm sure there's probably still quite a few people in your intimate community, whether it's friends or like colleagues, well, maybe not colleagues, sorry, but like maybe like peers from school and stuff like that, or university. I'm curious, do you find that there's still pretty like common misconceptions around kind of the current state of climate change, even around young people our age?
Definitely. So I would say there are three main misconceptions that I've observed. I mean, there are a lot of misconceptions, but these are the ones that irk me the most. So the first is the notion that climate scientists will fix this. So I get this a lot from, especially like, so in my class in university, I was the only person who was in the climate space. because everyone else was doing like high energy physics, nuclear physics, those kind of very intense theoretical or experimental physics realms. And I was this like kind of the hippie of the class, who was all like about the environment. Yeah. And so what a lot of my classmates and people who are not in the climate space, like who used to tell me was, it's fine. Like there's so many climate scientists, like they'll fix it for us. And that really, bothered me, because I was like, that's, we have no power actually. The people who have the power to fix climate change are the people in industry and government. And these are the sectors that, everyone else is going to work in, right? Like you're going to go to a corporate or you're going to go work for a government, and you guys have much more power than climate scientists do, because all we can do is sit there and advise policymakers, but there's no law that says they have to listen to climate scientists, and they're not, right? In most governments. So there is that, feeling of like helplessness, of like people not understanding that we can't fix this for you. It takes a collective mindset to fix this. And then the second misconception is that, we people always tell me that, it's okay, we can fix this from, we don't have to change capitalism. We don't have to change these systems. We can fix it from within these systems. And I'm like, these are the systems that caused climate change. Why do you want to fix it from within these systems? Why not, from a separate system entirely? And people don't think about reimagining this. So, like one example is when people say that, okay, take for example the infinite growth economy. So from every financial quarter to the next financial quarter, you need to see growth, right? Otherwise, your company is not successful. That's the benchmark we've set. And this concept of like linear infinite growth is so embedded in our economy, and our economy does not consider the fact that natural resources are finite. It's not even, it's nowhere in that economic model that Friedman or Reagan and Thatcher's neoliberalism have talked about. They do not factor in the fact that resources are finite and we're putting out pollution. So when you want to fix this from within a system that completely neglects these things, it's just impossible, I think. And and also people tell me that like, oh, but capitalism has brought so many people out of poverty into the middle class. And I'm like, yes, but now they're being put into a middle class that's told to aim for materialistic growth, and that's what they're going to do, and they're just going to keep contributing to climate change. So we need to change the system. We need to change the ideas that we feed to people. And the third misconception is kind of related to the ideas that we feed to people, is the media has no part to play in this. So especially my friends who are in media related industries or advertising agencies and stuff like that, they feel that their industry as a whole is so far from climate change that they don't really have to think about it. But I'm like, we consume media on a daily basis. Like, how many ads do we see in a day, right? And I'm not saying that they talk about climate change. I'm saying that the behavior that the media pushes onto us is what is causing this system to snowball into this giant avalanche that causes climate change, right? So, for example, like if you look at movies, Bollywood movies nowadays, they always have this. They've alienated the vast majority of Indians who live in the rural places. Like 800 million Indians live in rural places, but how many of your mainstream Bollywood movies are about people who live there? It's always about this like wealthy upper strata of society, right? And so what that inherently tells people is that, oh, you need to achieve this kind of a lifestyle in order to be considered successful. And you need to achieve this kind of a material accumulation in order to be considered, acceptable by society. And apart from movies, there's advertising that's always just trying to sell you stuff. And when we say that the media doesn't play a part in climate change, it's like all of these behavioral changes that the media does to us, that's essentially what's contributing to all of these climate change problems.
Yeah, that's huge. Thank you for sharing all of that. So, okay, just to kind of break down all of the like goodness you've just shared. So the three most common misconceptions are basically people thinking that like climate scientists are going to just fix it all and not realizing that they play a larger role as an individual. That we don't need to change our current systems, and that media doesn't play a role in this. And as you were talking through it, I was thinking like something I wanted to ask you was, based on all the countries that you've worked in, what trends have you seen in the way that local communities interact with climate change? But what I'm curious now about is just because as someone who is from Canada and has has interacted with climate change from a very Western point of view, and also been very privileged in terms of having like access to alternatives and really tuning into a conscious mindset at a young age, and being more aware of how media and systemic systems that I'm part of really played a larger role in these huge overwhelming topics. But I'm curious to your thoughts. I mean, in the context of India, I feel like the two biggest like misconceptions here are like talking about these systems of basically control and oppression. I just feel like there's so much work to do there before we even everywhere definitely, but I'm just especially in India and still being so heavily influenced by colonization and the British rule, and then having and people coming into these urban sectors and being completely just absorbed into their phones and media. And like I've never seen people interact with their phone the way they do in India, especially youth. Like just it's insane. So I'm curious. I mean, with India in mind, where do you think one of the biggest barriers are right now in terms of kind of like tapping into I guess the consumer mindset, because that's really what we're viewed as. But just what do you think needs to really be tapped in for more, let's just say for now, young people, because that's kind of like our hope right now. What needs to happen in order for us to really mold young mindsets to understand how large of an issue this is, and how we're all accountable and responsible to the solution?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, in India specifically, what I would say is there is this disconnect that I've observed between people, I would say, in my strata of society or wealthier, yeah, especially in urban spaces, with the much larger population that is, in rural India. And we have this notion that we are the average Indian, whereas we're not. We're like the 20%. And the 80% are the ones who live in rural India, right? So we kind of always feel like, oh, okay, like we should start consuming sustainably, and people are not doing it, and if everyone did it. But then when people of my generation here, when they think of that, like what they think of is, in their minds, it's a picture of all the people in their urban space consuming sustainably or living sustainably, but they don't realize that we have sold this kind of American dream to all of rural India, and they're all struggling to get into the spaces that we have occupied, and to imitate this kind of a lifestyle. And they're not going to learn about sustainability until it's too late, right? But what they don't realize is that their current way of life is much more sustainable than what we are living through in urban spaces. So I think the first step in India is to kind of understand what are the practices that we already have that are sustainable, and how do we not alienate entire groups of society, make them feel like they are lesser than us or whatever, and how do we bring them into the climate change conversation while respecting their knowledge and their opinions? Because especially like in urban spaces, I feel Indians have this tendency to feel that, oh, because I have a university education, I know more than the average like rural Indian. But they are the ones who face climate change directly, right? They know how it affects their land. They know that the seasons are changing. They might not know the term climate change, but they know what's happening. They know that, like, oh, decades ago the weather wasn't like this. We used to get more yields out of our crops, or we didn't have floods battering our towns or villages. We didn't have coastal floods, and they know that it's happening because of whatever is taking place in urban spaces. They're just not sure what exactly is happening there. So I think we need to bridge this disconnect. I think people of my age really need to get out into rural India and live with communities there, really understand what are the things that are worth preserving to communities, what are the takeaways, because there's so much to learn. I was like this. Like when I was a teenager, I used to really underestimate this. I grew up in Singapore, so I had this, like, in school I was um, fed this dialogue of, oh, Singapore is clean and green, and everyone has to be like us because look at us, we're so rich and happy, you know. And then I thought that there was nothing I had to learn from India. But then when I came to Kerala, it really changed my mindset about all of these things. And I learned so much from the communities there about nature and how to, what are the patterns that we observe? How do you, like rainwater harvesting, for example, is such a simple concept. And it's something that everyone has to do in Kerala because the government has mandated it. And it's just something that makes sense logically, but we don't think about it in like cities and stuff. We think of it as a futuristic thing, like, oh, rainwater harvesting is a new technology. It's not. It's an ancient technology, right? So there's all of these things that I think people my age need to learn, understand, and then realize that, okay, we need to preserve this, and then want to preserve it, and then want to bridge that gap between what we have defined as development, change that definition of development, and make it more inclusive of traditional lifestyles, rural lifestyles, and not make them feel like, oh, you need to kind of live the way that we do in order to feel like you are worthy.
Excellently put, like so succinct. So just to break that down, so it sounds like we as the young people need to understand that there is these practices that exist that have actually historically always been sustainable because they were kind of the more accessible options for rural communities. However, at this point, we've come so far that we've forgotten kind of how to connect back to the sustainable aspects of, different livelihood practices. And that's something that we could definitely take from rural sectors and start to understand how we can implement them back into urban sectors. And what I love about that actually is, as you were, talking through just your experience, like, I didn't think there was anything to learn from India, and then you get here, and there's so much. It's like overwhelming because I mean, historically, India's just always been so sustainable without even realizing it. And it's actually taken me a while to realize that was simply because of lack of access. That people had to kind of make do with what they had. And that also comes from a place of privilege, being like, oh, of course, like that's the only option that they had. But I couldn't agree more that there's a lot of traditional practices that root far back into the history of India that could actually do a lot of good in terms of helping in terms of different areas in environmental justice, specifically with climate change, that could make a huge difference. And so if that is kind of our biggest takeaway here in India, and I think that's like an excellent way to put it, and I think maybe the takeaway there is like every single young person in India needs to get out into the village again and reconnect with the soil, the people behind our agriculture, what's actually happening out there that's actually, fueling our lives in the urban sectors, because I think there's definitely a huge disconnect. So I'm curious then. So when it comes to other countries you've worked in, so my understanding, you've worked in Australia, you've worked through Europe, and you know, what what trends do you see in the way that locals interact with climate change that are different from India? And where do you see more or less action taking place? And why do you believe, that's happening?
So there's a huge difference between, I think, Europe and the way that Australians see climate change. I feel like Europeans, among the Western populations, I think they are the most concerned about climate change. I don't know if it's also because they're mostly like liberal or left leaning. Um, and so when I was in Germany, everyone's really conscious about, about climate change and living sustainably. They do sometimes, I think, a lot of the time actually, underestimate their carbon footprints because they don't think about the whole supply chain. But then I don't blame them for it, because I don't think anyone in the world really thinks about these things. So for example, Germans, like, if they cycle to work, or they recycle, they think that they are living sustainably, and they are living, compared to the rest of the population, that will be, relatively sustainable. But they don't realize that actually they're recycling, like whatever they put into recycling just gets shipped to China or Asia, and then a lot of it doesn't get recycled because it's just not recyclable. So they don't really see the end processes. And they don't also, like, when they go and go to organic grocers and buy organic produce, again, they don't see the effects that it has on, like, for example, um, if it's chia seeds or whatever's fashionable now, like, that's all grown in South America, and it's destroying a lot of forest land over there, and then it gets shipped halfway across the world to be put into these organic grocery shops, right? So they don't think about the supply chain there, but their intentions are good. They want to do something. And so it's just a matter of, like, kind of showing individuals how these supply chains also affect their carbon footprints. But in Sydney, I kind of felt that nobody really cared. There was this, like, it was more like, oh, okay, it's kind of a trend now to become vegan, or think about living sustainably. But for the most part, I think it's also got to do with how the governments have set up the place. So for example, in Sydney, it's just really annoying to get public buses. Like, the bus transport system there is quite, I wouldn't say terrible, but it's not the most reliant. Okay, you so most people prefer to have their own vehicle or have a car, because Sydney is very suburban. There's a lot of sprawl. There's a lot of suburban sprawl. So, and that just keeps expanding. And they're kind of okay with that, so they don't realize how that layout, that urban architecture influences their suburban architecture, influences their carbon footprint. So there's a lot of, like, they don't think about the ecosystems that they live in. But individually, I feel that in Europe especially, people really want to do something.
Yeah, that makes total sense to me. And as someone who's traveled to both places, I was giggling while you were saying, like, Australia doesn't care. Because I definitely felt that way when I was there. And, one of the usually when I'm like working with youth and talking about the effects of climate change and acting local is thinking or working globally, really, because the biggest example I usually give is like the journey of an avocado, because most kids
Yeah.
are like, I don't know where my avocados come from, and it's like, well, they don't come from here. Like, is it, well, in Canada, obviously. So, in terms of like talking about that journey of that product and them understanding all of the different, like how it affects the farmer, and then like how it's being transported, and then what happens to it when it finally gets to us, and the packaging. And, I think it really, I think it's really just, we forget to just slow down and think about, like, where do our products come from? And I think that's why, platforms like Amazon make so much freaking money because nobody really thinks about all of the background work that's happening with all of our products and services. Um, and it's one of the easiest places to actually start in thinking about, our the emissions that we're contributing to our planet. So thank you for noting that. And honestly, I feel like I could talk to you forever, but I'm going to start to wind us down, and I'm going to have to pick your brain another day more. But one of the things, to our dear listeners, so I came across Anjana on Instagram. I think it was the Sustainable Stories Forum, because they had recently posted a cute little story about my project How to World in Bikaner. And then they recently posted your story, and I instantly was like, oh my gosh, this human exists. I need to hear her story. And as soon as I went to your Instagram, I was just I was just really impressed by the approach that you were taking to educate people, to, bringing in this really creative, innovative element that was really kind of irreverent and silly, but still really getting to the point and diving into, the most crucial issues that we're facing. And my favorite one was actually around, it was around urban planning. So there's the disconnect between practicing local and traditional methods in the Arab and South Asia kind of worlds for cooling your home and combating climate change. And, I'm well, first of all, I want to know what made you feel okay, I just need to take all of my knowledge and bring it to the platform? Is that just because you were just tired of hearing people, just totally not understand what was going on? Or what made you think I'm going to put more time into really building out content that can educate people accessibly?
Mostly, yes. I mean, as you said, I was kind of tired of the misconceptions that people had about this, right? Also, it wasn't just that. It was also because I realized that, a lot of people just did not have the time or the energy or, the willpower to go and look for this kind of information. I mean, most people just don't, they have other things to do in life. So I was like, okay, since I care about all these things and I read so much, I might as well put it to good use and kind of try and show people that hey, maybe we all need to have a huge revolution and change all our systems. I mean, I'm just, I just wanted to show people the bigger picture, because I think everyone's kind of in their bubbles, and they form their opinions within those bubbles. And sometimes we need to have someone poke it and just let us know that there's a huge system at play.
That's huge. Yeah, I often refer to people as living in bubbles, just happily ignoring everything outside their little realm. But yeah, we definitely need to poke everyone's bubbles. I couldn't agree more. And thank you for what you do in bringing all of your knowledge to the platform so people can access it. So specifically, that post that I really resonated with me. I've just been talking a lot with young people around architecture in India, and green design and sustainable home design, and how to actually, just looking at some of the traditional methods, and looking even in the villages and using these very natural traditional materials to build that actually help with cooling. And there was always an intention. There's always intention around the products or materials that were being used, so they actually had a purpose, and it drove towards a solution. So whether that was cooling your home or etc. So I'm just curious, why do you think that after thousands and thousands of years of having these practices that have just been so sustainable for people, and for families, and I guess sustainable obviously wasn't the primary priority in terms of using green building materials, but I'm curious, in your perspective, why does India want to follow these more Western practices when we know that it just doesn't always work out for us here? When there are smarter, more affordable, and even super attractive options that can actually help us in cooling our homes and building spaces that are actually durable and not susceptible to so much damage year after year, like bricks and concrete. And yeah, so I'm just curious, what is it that makes us just want what's in the West?
So as you said, so there's two things. You said that when we know that it's more sustainable, but I think a lot of people just don't know and don't care, right? Because climate change is still a very relatively new concept in India, and it's a top-down approach here when it comes to education or anything really, any kind of information. So there'll be the upper echelons of society, they'll know about climate change, and then slowly the discourse kind of seeps into the masses conversations, and it hasn't yet. And secondly, I would say that it's also because it's just cheaper. It's actually scary that it's cheaper to use concrete or unsustainable materials than it is to use sustainable ones, because and this I will talk about in a future post, because shipping has because of the advent of large scale shipping, everything's just become cheaper to import than to get from your own country. So, so for example, just like building materials in general, it's much cheaper to build a concrete house than it is to build, something made of let's say, mud or earth bricks or whatever sustainable materials exist. Um, and then there is also the notion that, oh, okay, whatever the West is doing is imperatively better. Um, and that is something that we I think it's a social construct that we need to break. It's something that we've been fed from a very young age. It's, I think it's a remnant of colonialism, and it's just it has not left Indian society, and I don't know how long it will take to leave. But we always have this blind worship of whatever is cool in the West, and it's always like a decade behind. So I think, the climate change conversation in the West, it still hasn't started trending over here. Um, and yeah, and then there is also the exclusivity of green architecture. I think a lot of green architects here, they try to it seems like a luxury concept for most people. I was having this conversation with my friend recently, and he was like, "I feel that sustainable living or whatever. I feel that it's a rich person's." Um, and he's a middle class urban kid, right? But he felt that it's not attainable for him, and so I was like, "Oh, how many people would feel that way who are even less privileged?" So yeah, that there's all these factors at play when it comes to why we don't adopt traditional or sustainable building methods, because we just think that because it's cheaper to do the modern practices, and it's also, we just don't know, and we think that it's an exclusive um, domain.
Yeah, so I think another kind of golden piece right there is the fact that maybe I'm too optimistic in thinking that, you know, and thinking that the majority are aware and conscious of what is happening around us. But, uh, I think it's making it more evident every day that there is so much work to do. So,
Yeah.
thank you so much for sharing today. Like it is such a pleasure to hear all of this from you. And like I said, I feel like we're gonna have like a million other conversations. And but I know we covered a lot today, but I'm curious if there was one thing that you could like leave our listeners with today that they can do to play a bigger role in combating climate change, what would that one thing be?
I would say have the uncomfortable conversations. I think especially the people who listen to these kind of podcasts or are on social media are already a privileged section of society, especially in India. So with the contacts that they have, with the people they know who work in industries, who are in upper management of companies, who relatives who are running businesses, talk to them, have the uncomfortable conversations, ask them what their company is doing. Is it because companies, I think in Friedman's economics, he doesn't think about a company as a social organism, right? And we have to start thinking about that. So we have to start talking to people in industry and in corporates and showing them that actually industry, like the private sector, is the one creating the biggest impact on climate change. And I think, as the more privileged sections of society, we need to have those conversations with the people that we know can influence these decisions.
And do you believe that we can really make a change in the next 10 years?
On a ground level, I think education-wise, it's possible. It's possible if everyone wants to, right? It's about wanting to that I am more pessimistic about.
Inhale the goodness, exhale the bullshit. Thank you for listening, and thank you for doing the work. Be sure to jump over to curatedconsciously.co for more stories, tips, and inspiration for nurturing your conscious living journey. And be sure to follow along on Instagram at Curated Consciously. Huge shout out to my incredible husband, Profound Sound, for the original dope tracks. Hope you all enjoyed, are feeling a little lighter, and are going into a beautiful and blessed day.